Hello storm chasers, or birdcrafters, whichever you prefer. We've been waiting for a big storm to go and see these seabirds. Is it going to happen? It's getting a bit late really. Is COVID-19 going to give us the benefit of the doubt? It seems likely that we're going to get stalled in our efforts, but hey, we can but dream. I do hope we get a moment when we can get out to the coast to see these amazing birds. I'm going to be covering the tube noses and one or two other additional species as well. They are amazing migrants. There are amazing movements that these birds undertake. I hope you're going to get a little bit of an insight into that in the next few minutes or so as you're watching this presentation. Don't forget, keep thinking of questions that you want to ask me at the end in preparation for our face-to-face meeting over Zoom. I look forward to seeing you then. Take care. The northern fulmar is a true tube nose. You can see that structure on the top of the bill. It's also our most consistently observable tube nose along the UK coastline. It has a fascinating history, does the fulmar. It used to be a very scarce bird in UK waters, with the only colony based on St Kilda, and then comes along the modern fishing industry, which provided lots of offal in lots of different places from bycatch, and the fulmars took advantage of that, and they spread right around the coast and are now down the coast of Brittany and beyond. So it's a bird that's really expanded its range. It comes in two colour forms. The colour form that you see here, this pale form, is the one that we most typically see around British coastlines. It can have a white tail rather than a grey tail as shown here, but it's clearly got a very white head and a white underbody. And like a typical tube nose, it has rather stiff, slender wings, which it will use to glide over the ocean, using it almost in a sheer water-like fashion at times. But it's a heavier, bulkier bird than most of the sheer waters, so it tends to do a lot more flapping with a very stiff winged attitude, a very straight winged, so it doesn't look like a gull when it's actually flying. When you first look at this bird, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that it was something very exotic crossing our coastline, almost unrecognisable, but it's actually a fulmar. It's just a blue phase that comes in various shades to the blue phase, from a very pale form to this very dark form. I photographed this bird off Spitsbergen. Further north you go, the more prevalent the blue form becomes. Around our coastline you don't see any blue fulmars in the breeding condition, but you can see them during autumn storms at various times. I can remember being on the Norfolk coast one very late sort of September period, sitting at Cley and watching one of these birds come past, and I literally was confused at first because I wasn't anticipating seeing a blue fulmar. But they are just exactly the same species, it's just a colour morph, and they become very prevalent by the time you get into the Arctic waters. As you know, we do have locally breeding fulmars. If you go to any of the quarry sites along the North Wales coast, they seem to be fairly abundant there, and certainly some of the off islands. They're a regularly breeding bird, but it's usually on a northwesterly storm somewhere off Liverpool area, around Formby down to Leaso, around Hilbury Island, that you'll be seeing significant numbers of fulmars passing those localities during storm conditions. And that's because birds get either driven into the Irish Sea through a southwesterly airflow, and then it turns northwesterly and it drives them up against our coastline, or it could be just birds passing through from further north. And of course, if you did see a blue-faced fulmar anywhere off our coastline, then you can be pretty darn sure that it's come from a long way north. And as you look on here, the orange arrows indicate the more northerly populations, and certainly I've seen fulmars off Newfoundland, crossing the Labrador Current area, and again I saw blue-faced birds across that way. So they do seem to prefer these colder water conditions, but anytime we've got storm conditions in the northwest, we can anticipate seeing fulmars. Of all the tube nose species that occur at sea off UK waters, I think it's fair to say that the Manx shearwater is the quintessential tube nose. It breeds on a range of islands, and in fact, of course, it gets its name from the Isle of Man. Its scientific name is Puffinus puffinus, because it was misidentified as a puffin, but it was actually first recorded as the Manx puffin, which may explain the misnaming of this particular bird. Shearwaters, well, they do what they say on the tin. They literally shear over the waves. In very calm conditions, they're forced to do an awful lot of flap flight, and it's a flap, 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 glide, flap, 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 glide, and that's the sort of rhythm that they have. But as the wind picks up strength and the troughs begin to build it amongst the waves, then the bird begins to careen high up over a wave and then dive into the next trough, pick up speed, push up into the airflow, do the same again. It's like it becomes, as it gets stormier and stormier, the bird starts to loop and loop and then dive down into the troughs. It is a magnificent sight. One of the things that you will note about Manx shearwater is that their plumage tone can vary quite a lot depending on light conditions. So sometimes they look quite brownish on top, but mostly they look rather black. And certainly a bird on the upper side, you could be really struggling to see it against a dark and dismal sea because of the black colour melding into the colour of the waves. But as it turns and reveals the white underside, it really gives itself away. You can see the white notches behind the wing here, just cutting up into the rump area, and that's one of the giveaways for Manx shearwater. You also notice that the face is quite messy in terms of the amount of smudging and dark around and behind the eye and underneath it, and also like a band that runs down towards the breast, upper breast area of dark. And there's some of the things that help you to identify it and separate it from some of the rarer species, things like little shearwater, for instance. It's moderately long-winged as shearwaters go, not the longest winged, and you'll read in some text that the tips of the feet don't project beyond the tail, but I've certainly seen Manx shearwaters, certain Manx shearwaters, with the tip of their feet extended beyond the tail, and it just depends on the positioning of their actual feet in the resting point. So it can vary, so don't take that as a gospel if you read that in your books. When a Manx shearwater is shearing, at some point it's going to flip up and reveal the underside, which is startlingly white, apart from normally you can see a kind of cut of dark that runs through the inner underside of the wing, like a vein almost. But that bright white really shines up at a distance, and of course you've got the contrast with the blackish tips of the wing as well. You can see it's a sturdy old bird, is the Manx shearwater. Shearwaters in general are tough birds. They have to be, because they're surviving in some really dramatic conditions at times, so they've got to be able to battle through all kinds of weather. The actual name, the tube nose, and that feature that you get on the bill, has a function, and it's all about the excretion of salt, because of course these birds don't have any fresh water to drink, so they have to drink salt water, and so the only way that you can cope with that in terms of your metabolism is to be able to excrete the vast majority of that salt, so that you don't end up getting literally salt poisoning. So that's why the tube noses have that particular feature, but they also have a super keen sense of smell, and that enables them to literally sniff out their prey items over vast distances. They just follow the molecule trail of smell, and it will lead them to the manna at the end of the rainbow kind of thing. So that's what they're looking for. When you see them careening over the waves, they're usually tracking in towards the source of food. Now, of course, during storm conditions, they'll get driven inshore, and that's usually when we see them off our coastline in particular. You can see them regularly off the coastlines all around the UK at different periods. So during the breeding season, for instance, there are hundreds of thousands of them off Stockholm and Scoma Islands, and off the islands around the Calf of Man, and up around the various Scottish islands. There are literally hundreds of thousands of them. But our bit of the coastline, well, you might see them off Hilbury on a high tide at certain times, but really we need northwesterly winds to drag them inshore. And then you can see them twinkling in the distance, only during really severe conditions do we get them into the mouths of the river, like the Dee and the Mersey estuaries. And then you might go to New Brighton and see them in the mouth of the estuary there. One of the claims to fame of Manx shearwater is that it's the oldest known bird in the UK in terms of definite aging. So we know, for instance, that at least one bird, and probably it's typical of many, was at least 50 years old, because it was ringed back in the 1970s, and then it was recaught again in 2008 on Skomer Island. And this is not untypical of seabirds, this longevity. And I think it's pretty essential that they are long-lived, because the attrition rate for young birds is very high anyway. And then now, of course, we've got the added burden of plastic pollution. And I mentioned before about that incredible sense of smell. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that when plastic is in the ocean in microplastic form, it gets coated in an algae which gives off a smell which is very reminiscent, to the birds at least, of potential prey items. The smell that a krill type species might produce, for instance, some of the crustacea. And so they go and pick this up and they feed it to their chicks, and of course the chicks get full of plastic and they can't digest it and they die of starvation. Adults tend to be able to cope with it a bit better because they can regurgitate it, so they don't seem to be badly affected, which is probably why there's so many of these older birds around. But it just shows you the devastating effect that plastic has in the ocean. Now, UK birds, it seems, are less affected at the moment than some in other parts of the world, but it is definitely a feature. So you do wonder about the long-term prospects of birds like Manx shearwater. Now, Manx shearwater is a very long distance migrant indeed, and birds that breed in the UK after the breeding season, September onwards, start to migrate down towards South America. They cross the Atlantic and they end up off the Brazilian coastline, the Argentinian coastline, and they go all the way down as far as Cape Horn, and some of them even go round the corner to a degree. And so they've got to return, of course, and they tend to come up the eastern seaboard then of South America, and then up the eastern seaboard of parts of North America, and then jink across to the UK to be back in their breeding sites, generally by April, certainly by early May, to begin the whole process all over again. But we're covering 20,000, 30,000 kilometres in that annual cycle, and that's without the daily wanderings in search of food. So they are covering thousands upon thousands of miles, kilometres, whatever you want to describe it as, on any given year. And certainly a bird that reaches the age of 50 plus, it must be covering millions of miles in its lifetime. It wasn't until 1991 that Balearic shearwater was split from Manx shearwater. In fact, at that particular time, there were two distinct forms of Balearic shearwater, Mediterranean shearwater, whichever you prefer to call them, and they've been further split since then in the year 2000. But Balearic shearwater, or Balearic shearwater if you prefer, looks a bit like a Manx shearwater, but is much duskier underneath, so you could mistake it for sooty shearwater, which is another species that occurs around UK coastlines frequently. But Balearic shearwater is a stockier bird than is Manx shearwater. It seems to be a bit head heavy when you see it flying along, and generally even when it flips up to its underside, it doesn't show startling white. In fact, it usually just shows the pale belly area. Unlike the Manx shearwater, the Balearic shearwater never looks black and white. It always has a sort of brownish tone to the plumage, and then as you say, when it flips up on the underside, you see this sort of off-white coloration. It can be very minimal, just on a small patch of the belly, which I photographed off Flamborough a number of years ago. It's got a moderately extensive amount of pale on the underside, and you can see that the dark vein of darker plumage on the underwing, on the armpit area, seems to be a bit more extensive than on our Manx shearwater. And certainly the underwing isn't startlingly white either, so it gives you a starter for 10 if you like, in terms of, is this a Manx shearwater, is this a Balearic shearwater? And they have a strange sort of distribution in UK waters, because they actually do occur more frequently during the winter months than they do during the other parts of the year. So a storm during the winter is just as likely to bring you a Balearic shearwater as it would a Manx shearwater, in fact more so in many cases. And certainly if you go down to places like Portland and the Dorset coast and then other parts of Cornwall, there are now regular wintering flocks of Balearic shearwater that have been discovered quite recently. Now on our bit of the coastline, it really is a scarce bird, and it really tends to be only during storm conditions that they ever get reported. Somewhere like Point Linus in North Wales, in Anglesey, is probably one of the hot spots for them in our region. Again, maybe somewhere off the coast of South Stack, but we only very rarely get them into the mouths of the river during the big storms in September and October. You can see quite clearly in this image that sort of head-heavy posture and a thicker, stockier look to the bird. Also, if you look carefully, and mostly at Balearic shearwater, you'll notice that the tips of the toes tend to project beyond the tip of the tail far more frequently than you ever see it in Manx shearwater. And I think certainly if you saw this bird, you're far more likely to think you're looking at a sooty shearwater than Manx. However, there's a big difference between sooty shearwater and Balearic shearwater. Baleric's a stocky bird and looks relatively short-winged, stocky-winged even, compared to sooty shearwater. Sooty shearwater is a rakish bird, and we'll be looking at that in a moment or two. This is a very useful illustration showing the comparison between both Manx and Balearic shearwaters. It certainly illustrates all the various different points I was making before about the shorter winged look of Balearic shearwater, the fact that the tail is comparatively shorter and so that the tips of the feet tend to project beyond. It's a stockier, bulkier bird, and certainly the illustration showing the flock on the water at the bottom shows you that it always tends to look a bit bigger and bulkier, never black and white, and so I think the risk is more likely to think it's a sooty shearwater. Here you can see the distribution of Balearic shearwater and why they occur off the UK at times, because they're breeding in the Balearic Islands. They come out through the med after they've finished breeding, and instead of going south and out towards the areas off Argentina as Manx does, they actually go northwards, and that's why they occur off the UK during the late autumn and winter period. Totally different pattern to that you see with Manx shearwater. Sooty shearwater is another of the mega migrants. It does occur off UK waters in big numbers at various times in the autumn period, usually from sort of July onwards right through to early October. It's a bird that's travelled a very long way, but when you do see it, it does look distinctly different from Manx shearwater. It's a longer, slenderer, more rakish looking bird for a kick-off, obviously a dark on the underside, but with a startlingly bright silvery white patch on the underwings, which tend to stand out as the bird tips and turns as it goes across the waves. This is a bird that I photographed off Flamborough Head some while ago. It looks a lot darker than the previous illustration, even though it's the same bird probably. It just shows you the difference in the light. It does show up really well on the underwing on this, that silvery white patch. And it's always a curiosity to me that you find so many of these birds off Flamborough and Spurn and around that part of the North Sea than you do off our coastline. I photographed this bird off the west coast of New Zealand. Sooty shearwater has a very extensive distribution in the southern hemisphere, and they breed in big numbers all over the place. In fact, they're nicknamed the mutton birds because the native tribes people, whether they were Maori or different Polynesian peoples or people from South America, used to go out and harvest the birds in various areas and take the young out of the nests because they wouldn't be rich and fat and full of goodness for them to survive their lean periods of the year. So sometimes you still see colonies of 1 million, 2 million plus, and in fact myself and Anno had the amazing experience of seeing literally 1 million plus of these birds in the Beagle Channel only a few months ago. It was a very, very memorable experience. Most of the sooty shearwaters that we see in the UK don't come from New Zealand. We actually know that they come from Tristan da Cunha, and they breed there, and by the end of February they finish breeding and they head up the eastern seaboard of the South Americas and then up towards the North Americas, and they will spend a few months, a couple of months off the east coast of North America where they'll be molting, and then they whip across the Atlantic around about early July, right through to September period, and they end up in big numbers off the UK coastline. But you only see the big numbers during the right weather conditions, so that the birds are sort of driven over the top into the North Sea, or if we're lucky, they get driven up into the Irish Sea, and we might see them off our coastline as well. I only occasionally see them from places like Point Linus or from Formby or somewhere like that, but I have done it, so you could do it too. By the middle of October, they're virtually all gone, and just the last few birds are making their way southwards again down the western seaboard of the African coastline, and they're heading back to their burrows in Tristan da Cunha, and they're back there by November. It's known as a loop migration, and they're using the tailwinds to help them get around the globe in such a spectacular fashion. Corey's shearwater is pretty scarce off the UK. You can get big numbers off the southwest of the UK in certain conditions during sort of August, early September period, but in general it's very small numbers. But they can, just like the sooty shearwater, end up off somewhere like Flamborough or Spurn. They can go over the top and down into the North Sea. They're really rare in our part of the world. Only a handful of records from sort of the Mersey area, and they're probably more readily seen off parts of the North Wales coastline, that's for sure. This is a bird that's split quite recently into two different species. In the Mediterranean, there's another, now it's a new species called Scopoles shearwater, and Corey's is more of a breeder in the Atlantic waters. You'll certainly see it off places as far south as the Canary Islands. And this particular bird is a very big bird. It's larger, significantly larger than Manx shearwater and sooty shearwater. It's a bulky, heavy looking bird and lazy in flight, almost gull-like in flight. Much browner, as you can see, than Manx shearwater, but there's a bit of a hint of a white rumpish area just on the upper part of the tail feathers, and the bill is quite pale. The underside is brilliant white in contrast to the upper side, bit of duskiness around the throat, and that yellow bill often does stand out, as I mentioned before. But look at those beautifully black lined wings as well, and there's a long extensive dark tip to the wings, again adding contrast with the white. When you see this bird flying around, it tends to be in like this languid flight unless the wind starts to pick up. Unlike Manx shearwater, it needs much stronger winds to begin to start shearing over the waves, but when it does so, it can be spectacular because it wheels up really high up over the waves before dipping back into the troughs. I photographed this bird off the Azores, and you can see clearly that tube nose on top of the bill. You can also see that strong hook on the beak, and that's typical of all of the shearwaters. I strongly recommend not handling shearwaters unless you really have to, because that tip of that bill can rip into your fingers, and there's many a ringer will tell a sorry tale of shredded and tattered digits when they've been ringing Manx shearwaters. And this is a bigger bird, so you can imagine what it can do to you. There are a number of different populations of Corey's shearwater. For instance, there are populations down in the Canary Islands, there are populations off the Portuguese coastline, and they tend to have slightly differing wintering areas. I've certainly seen them when I've been on cruise liners in a number of different places, including sort of northern parts of South America into areas as far west, if you like, as the isthmus area, between the join, if you like, between North and South America, right into that far area. But similarly, I've also seen them quite well up towards the Newfoundland area. And what these birds do, they go on a loop migration, just as so many of these other seabirds do. And that's why we get large numbers, particularly in July and August, appearing off the UK coastline when there's a strong northwesterly wind that takes them across places like Cork or across the area of southwest England. And when I've been on a ship in those conditions, I've certainly seen hundreds of Corey's shearwaters right off the tip of Land's End. Quite a spectacular sight. As I say, they're really rare in our waters because they tend to miss out the Irish Sea, but in certain conditions they'll get driven up into the Irish Sea, and then if it switches northwest we have a chance of actually finding them along our coast. They tend to be an August, September bird rather than an October bird. Great shearwater is undoubtedly one of my favourite birds. Seen it in a number of different localities, but I was pretty old before I saw my very first one, because actually seeing them from mainland UK takes some doing. You've got to get them in exactly the right weather conditions. Since I started doing the ships, I seem to see them everywhere, and I certainly saw my first ones off the Biscay ferry very memorably about a decade or so ago. Having seen none at all, there I am crossing Biscay, and suddenly there are 1,600 of these birds out behind the boat. They're a bit like a Corey shearwater, but they're a darker brown with a beautiful dark cap with a white sort of collar extending up behind, and also that white at the base of the rump and above the tail is a bit more contrasted than that on Corey shearwater, so stands out more. The bird does look very capped in certain conditions, and it's got a brilliant white underwing with some darkish marks which I'll explain about in a moment or two. I took this particular photograph near Cape Horn. By contrast, I took this photograph off Newfoundland, and that shows you the distribution of this bird really. I'll explain more in a moment about that. If you look at the white underside, you'll notice it's got a really dark smudge on the belly. That's not contamination. It does actually have this brownish patch on the belly, so that's one of the main key identifiers for this bird. The white on the underwing is very contrasty, but there's an extensive area of sort of dark veining towards the inner part of the wing, almost like an exaggerated form that you see on the Manx shearwater. The cap does stand out here, as you can see. It's very clearly demarcated. It's a stiffer winged bird than Corey's shearwater. It's only slightly smaller. I don't know why it's called great shearwater really, because it is smaller than Corey's, but and it has a stiffer winged action than the lazy winged action of Corey's. It's a very extensive migrant, and you will sometimes see the odd bird, and then the next thing you know, you're seeing literally thousands of them. Sometimes I've been on ships out in the Atlantic somewhere, you know, or maybe off Madeira, or maybe somewhere like the mid-Atlantic ridge area, and there'll be thousands of great shearwaters all of a sudden, and they'll be flocking up just as you see Manx shearwaters doing off UK waters, and feeding in exactly the same way, sniffing out food supplies and troughing away, jumping into the waves, diving quite deep sometimes, just as you see with Manx shearwater. But this bird hasn't come from locally breeding islands. It's come from a very long way indeed. Just like the sooty shearwater, it breeds down at the bottom end of the South Atlantic. Just like the sooty shearwater, as I mentioned a moment or two ago, it breeds on Tristan da Cunha, and it does almost identical loop migration and spends part of the summer, as our northern summer if you like, off the Grand Banks area, molting its feathers, getting into good condition before whipping across the Atlantic to come down the western seaboard of Africa. But in the interim period, that July, August, early September period, you can get big numbers off the UK coast, but you never see them because they're out in the Atlantic. You need certain storm-driven conditions to take them across places like Porthgwarra and off the Cork coastline. And then literally thousands can be seen within a day. And I again have experienced that situation off Land's End when I've been on a ship and seen not just Corey shearwaters, but great shearwaters and sooty shearwaters mingling all around me. It was as if I'd been transported to another part of the world entirely, and not typically a UK waters area. We're going to go from great to very small indeed. European storm petrel is a very small tube nose, indeed very dainty, pitter-pattering across the waves, sniffing out little tiny patches of food. It could be very effectively chummed for. What you do is you put the things like fish oil in a bag and a bit of popcorn and stuff like that and scatter that on the ocean. It can bring birds in quite close because they're sniffing out their food. and you can see that they dance on the waves and almost walk on the water, and hence the name petrel, which is a corruption of St. Peter, who walked reputedly on water. One of the most useful field marks on a European storm petrel is this brilliant white stripe on the underwing. Our other regularly seen petrels don't have that, they have dark underwings, and so this is a feature that you can readily look for when you're seeing these tiny petrel-like birds. They also have a flickering wing style compared to some of our other petrels, storm petrels, and the white on the rump extends around into the sides of the flanks as well, and you can see that quite clearly on this bird. It also have a rather squared off tail, not so much forked as you see in the other birds. A very high forehead, as you can see. I bet you can't see that most of the time when you're out on the water, because these birds are hard to track. They're not much bigger than the size of a sparrow, so actually following one of these birds is a heck of a challenge. For such a small bird, European storm petrel migrates a heck of a long way. You can see from this graphic here, our birds and birds that breed even further north, up in Iceland and the likes, they migrate all the way down as far as the Cape of Africa. So after around about early September, you're unlikely to see this bird. They've gone away on their migrations, and if you're seeing one in late September, certainly early October, make sure you have a second look at it. It's probably not a European storm petrel, it's probably our next species, the Leach's storm petrel. Leach's storm petrel is the petrel that we see most frequently off the Wirral and Cheshire coastline. What we see it in sort of end of August through September, sometimes early October, when there are northwesterly storms. I'll explain a bit more about that a little later on. It's got these distinctive characters in the way it's got this angled wing, it's got a clearly V tail, the white rump has a sort of little grey patch running down the centre of it, and it's got these pale carpal bars which show up really well at a distance. It's a bigger bird than European storm petrel and has a more easy flight and bouncing flight over the waves, not flickery winged in the same way that European storm petrel is. Has a dark underwing and not a white stripe on the underwing. Leach's storm petrel has a very extensive distribution as a breeding bird. It breeds far north in colder waters. Nearest population to us is St Kilda. I photographed this bird off Newfoundland and the Labrador Current. And you can see that grey stripe down the rump on this particular bird as well. You can see how it holds its wings as well in that sort of cocked position, much more obvious than you see on European storm petrel. This particular bird is easily attracted to the smell of chum, and in fact I photographed birds on the Wirral coastline just once by putting down some cod liver oil on the edge of the beach, and they sniffed that out immediately during one of these storm events. Have a look closely now at the distribution of the bird. You can see from this distribution map that our birds, the locally breeding ones, at least in the UK and sort of Icelandic birds, don't go as far as the European storm petrel in their migrations. They do get down as far as the Cape Verdes, and they certainly are in the Biscay area in big numbers as well, sometimes during the winter, but certainly during the migration period it's a major stop off point for them. We get them in our waters for a particular reason. Where they're breeding up in St Kilda and up in Iceland and the likes, when they're coming down, they'll often get caught up in storm tracks that drive them up into the Irish Sea, coming up through the St George's Channel and the like, and then whipping them up towards the Isle of Man. And if that wind then switches, as it usually does, to a northwesterly, it will then drive them into the bay, into the Liverpool Bay area, where we then get to see them off the likes of New Brighton and Leasowe and Hilbury Islands, and they certainly get seen a large number of Point Linus and other locations like that. So that's why we see so many, and that's how come Leach's storm petrel is a symbol for the Cheshire and Wirral Ornithological Society, because in fact, rather than travelling all the way to St Kilda, most birders make the pilgrimage to New Brighton to see their very first Leach's petrel in the UK. Before I finish, I'm just going to mention a couple of other species that are not tube noses, simply because they do occur with frequency on our coastline during certain storm conditions in September, sometimes August, and even into October. So one is Sabine's gull. It's come a long way as Sabine's gull. It's come all the way across from the Canadian Arctic. and it's a very distinctive bird. It looks ostensibly at first a bit like a kittiwake, but it's got a much more tripartite colour pattern on the upper wing that is very much more distinct. This is a juvenile bird with this sort of grey-brown scalloped upper parts, and you can see that this particular bird has got a clearly forked tail as well. It's also got this startlingly black and white patch pattern on the wings, and that really helps you to discern it from the slightly similar juvenile kittiwake, which you could mix it up with, I guess. So this particular bird I photographed off Hoy Lake a number of years ago, and it was during one of those classic storm conditions, and it got left behind and hung around the Hoy Lake area for a couple of days, giving birders a chance to catch up with it. And I know that one or two of you have been lucky enough to see a Sabine's gull quite recently off the Hale area. Juveniles are more frequently seen in UK waters in the autumn, but we do get adults, and in fact this one was photographed at Pennington Flash a couple of years ago, and you can see that grey-brown on the back has been replaced by a lovely dark grey, which really creates a stunning contrast with the white and the black of the wings. The hood is a sort of blue-grey colour, and there's a yellow tip to the bill. It's a slightly daintier bird than kittiwake, but it's marginal, and so you'd be struggling to see the difference. And believe it or not, when I've been going down to Biscay in the autumn, I've seen more Sabine's gulls than I've seen kittiwakes, because that's one of their major winter hangouts, is the Bay of Biscay area. So it's no wonder that they turn up in UK waters periodically. So you'll see from the graphic here that the birds are coming from the Canadian Arctic, places like Baffin Island, making their way across towards the UK. They bypass us really, heading down towards Biscay. Many of them will hang around there for a large part of the winter, but many others go on down as far as the Namibian coastline of Africa, and then they'll come back across the Atlantic, head back up to the breeding areas in time for the spring, where they'll be breeding once again. So we do see them regularly, but there are many more birds out there than ever show up on the mainland coastline as they drift past the UK in the July, August, September period. Grey phalarope is an Arctic breeding species of wader, and it has two distinct types of habitat. One is the Arctic tundra, these little pools in the Arctic tundra where it'll be twirling around to its heart content in the summer months on the meltwaters off the tundra, and then it transforms into a seabird, and it comes south, and during storm track conditions coming across the Atlantic, many birds get driven up against our coastline, and they'll spend a day or two in places like the Wirral and off Hilbre, off Formby, or somewhere like that. They'll even turn up on inland waters where you can possibly get a decent image of the bird. As it happens, the last couple of photographs that you're going to see in this were photographed off the Wirral at New Brighton. I remember photographing this bird only 2 or 3 years ago. It spent several days in the New Brighton area after a storm had driven it across the Atlantic and into the Irish Sea, and it was recovering and twirling away like a good thing on the shores of the Mersey estuary. They twizzle around almost like a puppet, a marionette puppet being twizzled around, pecking away at the water rapidly. Got a thicker bill than has the red-necked phalarope, and got a sort of cleaner looking back rather than the dark marked back of that particular bird. This has got almost like a clear grey back to it, and they are similar to red-necked phalarope in the way that they behave, and they could easily be mistaken one for another, but we always associate grey phalarope, at least in our area, with these autumn storms coming through the northwest. It's highly likely that the majority of grey phalaropes that we see have come from the Canadian Arctic as they're making their way southwards and driven across the Atlantic, as say by these storm tracks. The movements of birds never cease to amaze, and the birds that I've shown you today are some of the longest distance migrants on the planet, and certainly some of the shearwaters just undertake unbelievably long distance migrations, but they're built for it. They spend a life on the wing really, So it's not an arduous task for them, and the fact they can live for 50 odd years or so just sort of tells you what tough characters these things are. They have to be to lead a life on our rough tumble oceans. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope you got something from it. Please come back to me with your questions. I'll do my best to answer them. I look forward to seeing your lovely faces in a few minutes' time.